The storm had been relentless. For 3 days, the small island I had been stranded on for months was battered by the typhoon, waves crashing against the jagged volcanic rocks with a force that seemed almost personal. The rain pelted down in sheets, soaking the narrow strip of sand I had come to call home, and the wind whipped the palm fronds until they snapped and groaned under the pressure. I had long since stopped counting the days. Time had lost all meaning here. Food had been a constant struggle ever since I washed ashore. Coconuts were plentiful, their tough shells a constant reminder that sustenance came with effort, and the only real protein came from the fish I could catch, either trapped in shallow tidal pools left by the retreating ocean or speared with the crude weapon I had fashioned from a broken branch and a jagged piece of metal from the freighter wreck. My diet was monotonous and relentless. I had once loved fish. In another life, I would have considered a fresh catch a delicacy, a reward. But after 6 months of surviving on nothing else, the taste had grown bitter, dull, and almost repulsive. Still, hunger demanded compliance, and I had no choice. The hurricane, or typhoon as they were properly called in these parts of the South Pacific, had kept me trapped inside the narrow lava tube I had turned into a shelter. Its walls, slick with condensation and streaked with dirt, had become my prison. I had spent those 3 days listening to the howling wind and the roar of the waves, keeping an eye on the crude fish traps I had set outside. On more than one occasion, I thought I heard voices carried on the wind, but each time it was only my imagination. Loneliness plays tricks on the mind, I had learned, and hallucinations were a constant threat when hunger and thirst gnawed at the edges of consciousness. By the fourth day, the storm had finally begun to abate, though the ocean remained restless. I stepped into the knee-deep water near the shore, scanning the churning surface for signs of fish. My crude spear slipped through the water as I lunged, grazing a silver flash along the side of a small fish. It darted away with a speed that mocked my frustration. "Damn it!" I shouted, more at my own helplessness than the fish. The tide had not yet fully receded, leaving deeper pools near the outer reef that I hoped would contain larger fish. I waded carefully, barefoot on the sharp volcanic stones, and scanned the water with narrowed eyes. And then I saw it, a glint of sunlight reflecting off something unusual in the water. My heart surged, hope and caution battling for dominance. But when I blinked and looked again, it was gone. I sighed, shaking my head. Perhaps it was just another hallucination, a cruel trick my mind played after months of isolation. Still, curiosity compelled me to investigate further. I moved toward a deeper tidal pool, the water rising to my knees, knowing that as the tide continued to fall, this pool would retain more depth than the others. I had learned over time how to read the ocean, to anticipate where the currents would leave pools brimming with life. But then, another flicker caught my eye, a brief flash from the horizon. I scrambled up one of the jagged volcanic rocks jutting from the sand, desperate for a better vantage point. From this higher perspective, my heart nearly stopped. A boat. My first sign of another human being in over 6 months. My pulse quickened, hope surging like a tidal wave, only to falter as I assessed the vessel. Its condition was dire. Both the fore and aft masts were broken, and water lapped dangerously near the portholes. Sunlight bounced off the glass in a brief shimmer. "Damn," I muttered. The only thing keeping it afloat was likely trapped air. Despite its state, it was the closest thing to salvation I had seen in half a year. The boat drifted slowly toward the coral reef, pushed by the wind still blowing hard from the storm. My mind raced, calculating the time before disaster. Even if it had been high tide, the water over the reef was only 6 feet deep. Judging by the way the boat was waterlogged, it must have had a draft deeper than that. In about 45 minutes, I knew, the vessel would be torn apart on the sharp coral, leaving only splinters and debris behind. I ran back to my shelter, the lava tube that had become my fortress and prison. Inside, I grabbed my second most prized possession, a crude handmade spear reinforced with metal shards, scavenged from the freighter wreck. My first prized possession was a small, waterproof journal I had kept since the first day I had been stranded, chronicling the slow decline of my sanity and the desperate measures I took to survive. Perhaps I should explain how I had ended up here. I had been hired as a cook on a freighter that ran the San Francisco to Tokyo route. Life on board had been routine, mostly monotonous, but comfortable. That all ended when the freighter was caught in another typhoon. The ship had begun taking on water so quickly that I barely had time to grab a life vest and leap into the churning ocean. As far as I knew, I was the only survivor. I had seen some of my crewmates abandon ship as it sank, but none had made it to land, or if they had, I never saw them. The first night at sea was a nightmare I would never forget. Waves like towering cliffs tossed me mercilessly, and the rain and wind threatened to drown me at every turn. For 3 days I drifted, powerless, with no food and no fresh water. In the South Pacific, hypothermia was less of a threat, but dehydration and starvation were ever-present enemies. By the second day, my vision blurred, and I began hallucinating. I knew that drinking seawater would kill me within hours, yet I was so parched that the thought crossed my mind. The rain that followed saved me, landing in sheets that I could gulp down to replenish what little life remained in me. Crawled across the sand, exhausted, toward the shade of a small overhang of volcanic rock. My body trembled with exhaustion, hunger, and a lingering fear I could never quite shake. I had survived the freighter, survived the ocean, and survived the first night on this isolated island. But now, after months alone, my mind and body had learned to adapt. I had learned how to catch fish, crack coconuts, and make rudimentary fire without proper tools. I had learned patience and endurance beyond what I thought possible. But even as I gathered my strength, I couldn't stop thinking about the boat. Even in its ruined state, it was hope. Perhaps the only hope I had seen in 6 months. I didn't know what I would find on board, but I knew I had to try. I had survived a freighter sinking, I had survived the ocean, and I would survive this. Even if the odds were stacked against me, even if the boat was doomed to the coral reef, I had to try. The storm had passed, but survival was only beginning. And as I stared at the distant glint on the horizon, I realized that in the struggle to live, hope was a weapon as vital as any spear or fire I could make. The first light of morning broke through the thinning clouds, illuminating the jagged volcanic coastline that had become both my prison and my sanctuary. The wind had died down somewhat, though the sea remained restless, its surface a swirling canvas of gray and green, punctuated by whitecaps that reflected the weak sunlight. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered, leaving the island battered and my mind restless. I stood atop a jagged rock, the only vantage point high enough to see beyond the shallow tidal pools and jagged reefs. My eyes locked onto the object I had glimpsed the previous day, a boat, or what remained of one, drifting slowly toward the coral reef. My heart leapt at the sight. After 6 months alone, the sight of another human vessel was electrifying. I had imagined rescue countless times, but this was the first tangible possibility I had ever seen. The boat was in terrible condition. Both the fore and aft masts had snapped like twigs under the storm's fury. The hull was slick with water, and the portholes were dangerously close to submersion. Sunlight glinted off the glass, the briefest sparkle signaling trapped air that kept the vessel afloat. It was a fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. I cursed under my breath, knowing that this floating relic of civilization was doomed to meet the coral reef in less than an hour if it continued on its current path. I scanned the surrounding waters for a safer approach. The tide was still falling, which meant that the deeper pools closer to the outer reef would hold water longer, but the approaching reef would soon block access. At high tide, There was roughly 6 feet of water over the coral, but judging by the waterlogged draft of the boat, it would scrape the jagged formations with violent inevitability. 45 minutes I calculated. That was all the time I had to act. I ran back to my lava tube shelter, my bare feet skimming over the wet, jagged rocks. Inside, I gathered my most valued tools, my crude spear reinforced with shards of metal from the freighter wreck, a jagged knife, and the small container I had fashioned to carry fresh water. Each item was a lifeline, painstakingly crafted over months of isolation. The spear had saved my life countless times, spearing fish from shallow pools or defending me from the occasional curious wildlife. The knife had been scavenged from the freighter, and though dull, it was versatile enough to hack through driftwood, cut rope, or pry open coconuts. As I stepped back onto the sand, I took a deep breath, letting the salt air fill my lungs. The weight of isolation pressed against me, heavy and unyielding, but it was counterbalanced by the surge of adrenaline pumping through my veins. I wasn't just fighting the elements anymore. I was fighting for a chance at something bigger, something beyond this island's relentless monotony. I waded into the knee-deep surf, careful to avoid the hidden coral below the surface. Each step was deliberate, my body aware that one misstep could mean injury or worse. The boat was closer now, the wind nudging it relentlessly toward destruction. I could see the water seeping into its hull, the boards creaking under the pressure. I cursed again, muttering under my breath as if the universe could hear me. There was no time for hesitation. Reaching the edge of the shallow reef, I paused to assess my options. Swimming would be slow and exhausting, and the jagged coral threatened to shred my skin and cut my feet to ribbons. I noticed a fallen branch nearby, buoyant and sturdy enough to serve as a paddle or makeshift raft. With a quick motion, I pushed it into the water and grabbed it, testing its buoyancy. Satisfied, I waded further, then dove into the water, using the branch to guide me toward the boat. The ocean roiled around me, waves slamming into my chest and pulling me under with alarming force. Each breath was a battle, each stroke a test of endurance. Memories of the freighter's sinking flashed through my mind. How the ocean had tossed me like a rag doll, how the life vest had barely kept me afloat, how despair had threatened to drown me even more than the waves. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. This time, I would not be defeated. As I neared the boat, the extent of its damage became painfully clear. The hull had been cracked along its starboard side, water rushing in with every tilt. Debris floated around it, broken planks, splintered masts, and fragments of the storm's fury. Yet amidst the destruction, there were signs of opportunity. A rope coiled neatly on the deck, some barrels bobbing just above the waterline, and a small, sealed crate that had somehow survived the chaos. I clambered aboard, balancing precariously on the slick surface. Each step threatened to send me sliding into the sharp coral below, but necessity outweighed fear. I reached the crate first, prying it open with my knife. Inside, I found a small stash of canned food, mostly preserved fruits and vegetables. It wasn't much, but in my current state, it was a feast beyond imagining. I grabbed as many cans as I could carry, shoving them into the waterproof container I had brought. Next, I turned to the rope. It was thick, heavy, and still sturdy despite the storm. I coiled it carefully, knowing it could serve multiple purposes, securing shelter, dragging heavy objects, or even creating a rudimentary fishing net. My mind raced with possibilities, each one a small step toward survival. The small barrels proved trickier. One contained fresh water, thankfully sealed and intact. I heaved it toward myself, the weight straining my arms, but the thought of quenching my thirst made it worthwhile. Another barrel was filled with salt, which would be invaluable for preserving food or seasoning my otherwise bland meals. I smiled grimly, realizing that the universe had given me a reprieve, if only for a few fleeting moments. Then, A sudden groan from the boat startled me. The hull shifted beneath my feet, water rushing in faster. The boat had settled further into the coral, and I realized I had little time left. I grabbed a final handful of supplies: a small first aid kit, a coil of fishing line, and a battered but functional flashlight. My arms ached, my chest burned, but I knew retreat was necessary before the vessel broke apart entirely. I leapt into the water, guiding myself back toward the safety of the shore. The boat creaked and groaned, its final moments approaching. A massive wave slammed against it, sending a spray of water into my face. Behind me, the hull cracked and splintered, pieces of wood and debris scattering into the sea. I didn't look back. Survival demanded focus, not regret. Back on the sand, I collapsed, gasping for air, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. I surveyed my salvaged items: canned food, fresh water, rope, and basic survival tools. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to tip the scales in my favor. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. The ocean had tried to claim me, the storm had battered me, and isolation had tested me, but I had endured. I had survived. As I rested, I thought about the future. This island was harsh and unforgiving, but it had taught me resilience. I had learned to read the tides, to anticipate storms, to endure hunger and thirst. And now, with these new supplies, I had a fighting chance to do more than merely survive. I could thrive. But the ocean remained unpredictable, and danger was never far. I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges: more fishing, more shelter repair, more threats from nature. But for now, I allowed myself a moment of triumph. The storm had passed, the boat had given me hope, and I had survived against the odds. Hope, I realized, was as vital as any tool, any weapon, any morsel of food. It was the spark that kept me alive, the fire that pushed me forward, and the only thing that could turn isolation into endurance. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, I made a silent promise. No matter what came next, I would endure, I would adapt, and I would survive. The first moments back on the sand felt almost unreal. My lungs still burned from the exertion, my muscles screamed in protest, and the relentless South Pacific sun beat down, harsh and unrelenting. Yet, amidst the exhaustion, there was a strange exhilaration. I had survived the ocean's assault, claimed what I could from the wrecked vessel, and returned with tangible proof that hope still existed. The supplies I carried were heavy, but they were life itself: canned food, fresh water, rope, and tools. Each item represented a small victory in a war that had been raging against my isolation and the elements for months. I dropped my haul near the shelter and sat on the coarse sand, letting my body absorb the warmth of the sun after weeks of storms and chill nights. My mind, however, refused to rest. The storm had left debris scattered across the island, and I knew that scavenging wouldn't end with the boat. Driftwood, broken branches, coconuts, and other remnants of the sea could all be repurposed. Survival had become a constant calculation of risk and reward, and I had learned that laziness or inattention could be fatal. With my newly acquired rope, I began fortifying my shelter. The lava tube I had carved into habit over months was functional, yes, but it had vulnerabilities. The storm had widened cracks in the rock, and water had seeped in at several points. Using rope, I secured makeshift barriers, tying bundles of driftwood across the entrance to keep debris and any curious wildlife at bay. I also used pieces of the broken mast from the wrecked boat to reinforce sections of the shelter roof, creating a small overhang that would shield me from both sun and rain. The barrels of fresh water were a godsend. I had spent months relying on rainwater, collecting it in hollowed coconut shells or shallow pools. Now, with a sealed barrel, I had a reserve I could ration. Each sip was a luxury, a reminder that I was not merely surviving, but beginning to reclaim some semblance of control over my environment. I even used some of the rope and the barrel to construct a rudimentary pulley system, allowing me to hoist water up from a lower depression in the sand during high tide. Ingenious or not, the act itself filled me with pride. I had survived the ocean, now I could survive this island with a little cleverness. Fishing, of course, remained essential. I waded into the tidal pools, spear in hand, studying the movements of the fish with patience born of necessity. Months of hunger had sharpened my senses, tuned my reflexes, and deepened my understanding of the ocean's rhythms. Using a combination of traps and my spear, I managed to secure enough fish to supplement the canned food. It was still monotonous, still necessary, but the addition of variety, fresh fish combined with preserved goods, was an emotional boost I hadn't realized I needed. Beyond the practical tasks, my mind began to wander into reflection. I thought of the freighter and my crewmates, of the storm that had taken everything from me, and of the months of solitude that had taught me patience, ingenuity, and endurance. Each memory was bittersweet, painful reminders of loss, but also proof of my resilience. I realized that survival wasn't merely physical, it was psychological. I had to maintain hope, creativity, and determination, even when the horizon offered nothing but endless water and jagged rocks. The small first aid kit I had salvaged became a focus. My body bore countless minor injuries, scrapes from the volcanic rocks, cuts from fish hooks and coral, and bruises from falls during my ocean voyages. The kit wasn't fully stocked, but even bandages and antiseptic wipes were invaluable. I cleaned my wounds, wrapped them carefully, and mentally cataloged areas of my body that were most vulnerable. Each bandage applied was both a physical protection and a small victory against the relentless toll the island exacted. I spent the afternoon exploring further than I had in months. The coastline stretched farther than I remembered, and the storm had washed in new debris, pieces of wood, empty crates, and even a large section of a mast that had broken off from the freighter. Each piece had potential: firewood, building material, or tools. I dragged what I could back to my shelter, noting that each haul made me stronger, more capable, and more confident in my ability to survive. By evening, I had created a small system of organization. Food went in one corner, fresh water in another, tools within easy reach, and fishing gear neatly arranged near the tidal pools. The island, once chaotic and overwhelming, was slowly yielding to my efforts. It was still unforgiving, still dangerous, but for the first time, I felt a sense of mastery. My survival was no longer purely reactive. I was proactive, planning and improving, building a life amidst isolation rather than merely enduring it. As night fell, I lit a small fire near the entrance of the shelter. The flames danced across the walls of the lava tube, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. I cooked the fish I had caught earlier, savoring the warmth of the flames and the smell of food that no longer seemed like mere sustenance, but a symbol of resilience. Each bite was a reminder that I was still alive, still capable, and still in control of my destiny, if only within the limited confines of this island. Sleep that night was deeper than any I had experienced in months. My body, exhausted from the physical labor of the day, relaxed in the presence of the fire's warmth. My mind, however, remained alert. Even in dreams, I planned for tomorrow: more fishing, fortifying the shelter further, exploring the outer reefs, and preparing for future storms. The ocean, while calmer than the previous days, remained a constant reminder of nature's power and unpredictability. I knew that complacency could be fatal. In the quiet hours, I reflected on the small victories of the day. I had survived a dangerous salvage, claimed life-sustaining supplies, and improved my shelter. I had reinforced my body, organized my resources, and strengthened my resolve. Hope, I realized, was not a passive state. It was an active force, something that had to be maintained, nurtured, and acted upon. The ocean had tested me, and I had responded with action, ingenuity, and courage. By dawn, I was already awake, standing on the rocks and watching the sun rise over the horizon. The tide was receding, leaving pools rich with fish, and the air was filled with the cries of seabirds returning to the shore. The island was alive, dynamic, and unpredictable. But now, I felt a part of its rhythm rather than a victim of its chaos. I had survived, adapted, and grown stronger. The storm had passed, but survival would continue to demand vigilance, courage, and resilience. The day ahead promised new challenges. There would be more fishing, more exploration, and more preparation for whatever the ocean might throw at me next. But for the first time in months, I faced the day with a sense of optimism. I was no longer merely surviving. I was reclaiming my life, piece by piece, breath by breath, and day by day. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the gray storm clouds that had dominated the past few days. The island was quiet, save for the gentle lapping of waves against the jagged volcanic rocks and the distant cries of seabirds. After months of solitude, every sound, every ripple of the tide had become a signal, a reminder that life persisted, even in the harshest conditions. I rose from my makeshift bed of driftwood and palm leaves inside the lava tube shelter, stretching muscles that ached from the previous day's labors. The fire from the night before had died down, leaving only warm embers and the faint smell of smoked fish lingering in the air. The shelter, reinforced with pieces of the broken boat, rope, and driftwood, now felt like a true sanctuary, a place I could control, even if only partially. Water was the first priority. I lifted the sealed barrel I had salvaged from the wreck and rolled it toward the edge of the lava tube. Using the rudimentary pulley system I had constructed with rope and driftwood, I lowered it carefully into a shallow depression where I had previously collected rainwater. The barrel's weight threatened to topple me, but months of survival had honed my balance and strength. The sound of water sloshing inside was a comforting rhythm, a reminder that life could be sustained with the simplest tools and a bit of ingenuity. After securing water, I turned my attention to food. The tidal pools had receded slightly with the morning tide, leaving shallow pools teeming with fish and small crustaceans. Armed with my spear and a few hooks made from twisted metal scraps, I waded into the water. Patience was crucial. One wrong move, and the fish would scatter, leaving me empty-handed. I struck with precision, catching enough to supplement the canned food I had salvaged. Each catch was a small victory, a reaffirmation that I had adapted to the island's rhythm, that I could thrive even in isolation. With immediate survival needs met, I ventured farther along the coastline than I had dared in months. The storm had shifted much of the shoreline, uncovering hidden pools and rocky outcrops previously inaccessible. I discovered a shallow cave, partially hidden by jagged rocks, that could serve as a secondary shelter or storage area. Inside, I found debris washed ashore. Small wooden crates, fragments of rope, and even a few rusty cans. Most were unusable, but some could be cleaned and repurposed. I dragged what I could back to my main shelter, noting that each discovery made the island feel slightly less hostile, slightly more like a place I could dominate with effort and ingenuity. Exploration also brought reflection. I thought of the freighter, the storm, and the months of solitude that had tested me to my limits. Memories were both comforting and painful. Images of my crewmates, the chaotic sinking, the endless hours adrift in the open ocean. Loneliness had become both a companion and an adversary. I had learned to talk to myself, to maintain a narrative that kept my mind sharp and my hope alive. The journal I carried, though weathered, remained a lifeline, a record of every thought, every plan, every day survived. Nightfall brought with it a profound sense of stillness. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky in patterns I had long forgotten, and the moon cast silver light across the waves. I tended the fire, cooking the fish I had caught earlier and savoring each bite. Food had become more than sustenance. It was a reward for ingenuity, endurance, and sheer will. I cleaned the fish carefully, wrapping fillets in palm leaves and cooking them over the embers, the smell reminding me of distant memories of home, of kitchens and warmth, of life before isolation. Sleep was lighter than usual. Even in rest, my mind catalogued threats, opportunities, and strategies. The ocean could turn violent at any moment, and the island had secrets yet to reveal. But there was also hope, a fragile, persistent spark. The supplies from the boat, the newfound secondary shelter, and the growing mastery of my environment gave me a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. I was no longer reacting, I was anticipating, planning, adapting. The next morning, I focused on long-term strategies. I constructed a simple rainwater collection system using the barrels and salvaged rope, ensuring that even if the skies remained clear for weeks, I would have a steady supply of fresh water. I reinforced the shelter further, securing the roof with larger pieces of driftwood and using rope to tie rocks as anchors. Each improvement was small, incremental, but collectively they transformed my living space from a temporary refuge to a semi-permanent habitat. Hunting and fishing became more methodical. I set traps along the pools, crafted hooks from metal fragments, and even began experimenting with makeshift nets. Each successful catch reinforced my confidence. Hunger, once a constant tormentor, was now a manageable challenge. The island's resources, though limited, were sufficient for survival if approached with patience and planning. Beyond survival, I began experimenting with small comforts, constructing a platform from driftwood to sit and observe the ocean, using rocks and sand to create a small cooking area, and even attempting rudimentary tools for sharpening spears and knives. These small acts of normalcy were vital. They reinforced my identity, my humanity, and my connection to a life that had once existed beyond the isolation of the island. Reflection became a daily ritual. I contemplated the nature of survival, the balance between physical endurance and mental resilience. The storm had been a crucible, stripping life down to its essentials, testing both body and spirit. I realized that the months of isolation had strengthened me in ways I had never imagined. Fear was still present, but it was tempered by experience. Loneliness remained, but it was now punctuated by purpose. I had survived, adapted, and even begun to thrive in an environment designed to test every limit. By the fourth night, a sense of equilibrium settled over me. The fire burned low, the tidal pools glimmered in the moonlight, and the island seemed momentarily calm. I reflected on the journey thus far, from the freighter's sinking to my first days on the island, from near death in the storm to the salvaging of the boat, and finally to the slow, deliberate process of adapting to this harsh world. Each day had been a lesson, each challenge an opportunity to learn and endure. And yet, even in this fragile peace, I knew that danger was never far. The ocean could rise again without warning, storms could return with vengeance, and the isolation could erode the mind if vigilance faltered. But I felt ready. I had tools, supplies, knowledge, and most importantly, a resilient mind. Hope had become a companion, not a fleeting thought, and I knew that as long as I maintained it, survival was not just possible, it was inevitable. The island was no longer merely a place of suffering. It was a world to be understood, mastered, and navigated. I had learned to read the waves, anticipate the tides, and find sustenance where others would see none. I had transformed desperation into strategy, chaos into order, and fear into determination. As I lay down that night, the stars mirrored the waves, countless points of light reflecting endless possibilities. I understood that survival was a journey, not a destination, and that each day brought both challenge and opportunity. The storm had tested me, the ocean had challenged me, and the isolation had forced me to confront the limits of my endurance. But I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable than I had ever been before. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring new challenges. The island still held secrets, resources yet to be discovered, and dangers waiting in the shadows. But for now, I allowed myself a measure of peace, a recognition that I was no longer merely a victim of circumstance. I was a survivor. The days had become a rhythm, each one blending into the next, yet each carrying its own trials. The island, once a place of terror and isolation, had become a terrain I could navigate with increasing confidence. I had learned to anticipate the tides, to read the wind, and to spot the subtle signs of life hidden among the rocks and foliage. Survival was no longer merely reactive, it had become deliberate, methodical, and even creative. The fire crackled in the early morning breeze as I prepared to embark on my daily routines. Fishing came first, as it always had. I had perfected the use of the pools left by the receding tide, placing traps and nets strategically so that the fish would have no chance of escape. My spear, sharpened and balanced perfectly, was ready at my side. Even the most elusive fish no longer eluded me for long. Each catch was a triumph, a testament to the months of adaptation that had sharpened my senses and honed my reflexes. The salvage from the boat had become a cornerstone of my daily survival. The barrels of fresh water were now part of a system I had refined, using gravity to channel water into smaller containers I could carry while exploring or fishing. The rope had been woven into nets, trap mechanisms, and structural reinforcements for the shelter. Every item was used to its fullest potential, and in doing so, I had transformed the island from a hostile environment into a manageable, even predictable, home. Exploration had taken on new dimensions. I ventured deeper into the island than ever before, discovering hidden pools, patches of edible vegetation, and caves that offered shelter during sudden squalls. Some caves were dangerous, their floors slick with water or sharp rocks, but others contained treasures of driftwood, abandoned nests, or shells I could use for tools. Each discovery reinforced my understanding of the island's ecosystem and allowed me to exploit it more efficiently for survival. The nights, however, remained a time of reflection. I sat by the fire, cooking fish or roasting coconuts, and allowed my mind to wander. I thought of the freighter, my crewmates, and the moment the storm had claimed our vessel. The ocean had seemed endless and merciless, but the island had taught me that survival was about more than strength. It was about ingenuity, patience, and perspective. I had learned to endure discomfort, to turn scarcity into opportunity, and to use fear as a motivator rather than a paralyzer. One evening, while watching the sun sink below the horizon, I noticed a glint far offshore, a brief, fleeting reflection of sunlight on the water. My heart leapt. After months of isolation, any sign of life beyond this island was both terrifying and exhilarating. I strained my eyes, scanning for movement, for anything that indicated another human presence. Perhaps it was another wreck, or perhaps a passing ship, but the mere possibility of connection was enough to stir a surge of hope deep within me. I had grown accustomed to solitude, yet the human instinct for companionship remained strong. Months of self-reliance had fortified my body and mind, but I understood that isolation could wear even the strongest spirit down. The fleeting glimmer of light reminded me that the world beyond this island still existed, and that my efforts at survival were not in vain. I could endure here indefinitely, but the thought of returning to human society, of being rescued or at least finding others, was a beacon I could not ignore. The island itself seemed to acknowledge my mastery. I had established a clear system, traps and nets in the pools, barrels of fresh water strategically placed for collection, and a well-fortified shelter that could withstand storms. I had discovered edible plants and fruits, and the combination of fresh fish and salvaged canned goods made for a varied diet, that sustained both body and spirit. Even the wildlife seemed to recognize my presence. Birds would perch nearby, unafraid, and small animals skirted the perimeter, avoiding traps while offering subtle indicators of the island's hidden resources. One particularly bright morning, I decided to explore the outer reef, a jagged expanse of coral that stretched further than I had ever dared venture. I moved carefully, my feet protected by makeshift sandals of bark and rope, scanning for sharp protrusions and dangerous currents. The reef was a world unto itself. Schools of fish darted beneath the surface, colorful corals swayed with the tide, and occasional shells or driftwood offered potential tools or food. I collected what I could safely carry, careful not to overextend myself, knowing that every step could mean injury if I was not vigilant. Returning to the island, I cataloged my findings, storing shells, driftwood, and other items for later use. My fire burned brightly in the evening, casting long shadows across the sand, and I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. I had transformed from a man struggling to survive into a man capable of thriving, mastering not only the physical demands of the island, but also the psychological challenges of isolation and fear. Sleep that night was calm and deep. The waves lapped gently against the shore, the stars shimmered overhead, and the fire's embers glowed softly. I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, from the chaos of the freighter's sinking, through the relentless storms and the months of survival, to this moment of careful mastery over my environment. The island had tested me, stripped me down, and forced me to confront my limits. Yet in doing so, it had revealed strengths I never knew I possessed. Hope had become more than a fleeting thought. It was a guiding force. I no longer feared the storms, the isolation, or the unpredictable ocean. I had learned to anticipate, to adapt, and to endure. Every day was still a challenge, but each challenge was now an opportunity to demonstrate resilience, creativity, and courage. I understood that survival was not simply about living day to day, it was about mastering one's environment, understanding one's limitations, and cultivating the inner resources necessary to thrive. Weeks passed in a rhythm of preparation, exploration, and reflection. I refined my shelter, improved my traps, and continued to explore the hidden corners of the island. I learned which pools retained the most fish, which plants were edible or medicinal, and how to conserve energy while maximizing yield from the environment. The island had become a laboratory of survival, and I, its diligent student, had learned lessons that would last a lifetime. One day, while resting on a rocky outcrop, I noticed movement on the horizon, a distant shape that might have been a ship. My pulse quickened. I squinted, tracking the shape as it moved slowly with the currents. Perhaps it was wishful thinking, or perhaps reality. Either way, I felt a surge of determination. After months of isolation, I understood that hope was not a passive emotion, but a call to action. I would signal, create visibility, and do everything within my power to ensure that if help existed beyond this island, it would find me. The sun set in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, casting the island in a warm, almost magical light. I tended the fire, cooked my catch, and reflected on how far I had come. I had endured a typhoon, survived the open ocean, salvaged a wrecked boat, and transformed a hostile environment into a domain I could navigate and control. My body was stronger, my mind sharper, and my hope more resilient than ever. As I lay down to sleep, I understood a fundamental truth. Survival was about more than endurance. It was about adaptation, courage, and the refusal to surrender to despair. The island, once a prison, had become a teacher, and I had learned its lessons well. I was no longer merely a man clinging to life. I was a survivor, resilient, resourceful, and filled with hope. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, perhaps there were others. Perhaps the world I had lost was waiting. I would endure, I would adapt, and I would face whatever came next with strength, determination, and the unyielding belief that I could not only survive but thrive.